You've ever wondered what it takes to develop your own automation process and then go open source? Michał has all the answers you need. Michał Krzyżanowski, ladies and gentlemen. A big round of applause.
Thank you. After being announced by Krzysiek, I am compelled to use a more radio voice, but I won't compete with Dolby quality. Hi. Today I'm going to tell you a story about Bobcat. It's not going to be a sales pitch about this framework. I'm not going to go into details about how this framework works. I want to tell you what I have learned when we went open source as a project till this very day. So how many of you have heard before about Bobcat before coming here? Yeah. So that's the thing. This is not a very popular framework. We have only 72 stars. So, but we are using it still internally, and we have external users. So something that is still a surprise for some people, even in our company. But for example, Fluent Lenium, Sławek Razymiński is also on Testwarez. He is the maintainer of the Fluent Lenium framework. They have like 10 times the number of stars. So a few dates, a bit of a timeline. Our journey began almost 3 years ago. Karol Kujawiak, who was then the product owner of our test framework, has pushed the first commit, but it wasn't the official release. It took us about 2.5 months to actually release version 1.0, and shortly after we sent an internal email in the company telling that Bobcat is now available for everyone to use. There were big celebrations, pat on the back and stuff like that. And we had like 4 main principles that we wanted to have in Bobcat. It was to have the framework as a maintainable thingy, to be stable. So it was supposed to help testers with test automation. It was supposed to be scalable, whatever that means, but it's a catchy, right, term. And it was tailored to AEM. AEM is Adobe Experience Manager. This is basically a CMS that we are working with at Cognify. This is like WordPress for rich companies. And this was the plan. After some time, people left the company, including most of the original Bobcat team. And together with Daniel Madejek, we decided that we need to do something about the current situation because maintainable was only a dream. It was a pain to actually maintain a framework after such time. So we have hacked a roadmap together, and we have released version 2.0 at the end of the previous year. Actually, it's 2.0.1 because I have messed up the release. I forgot to include an important bug fix, so quality assurance engineer doing releases, right? And 3 years later, here we are, and some random numbers. We have over almost 1,000 commits, 200 issues, over 200 pull requests to the repository, and 16 contributors, also some people outside of the company. But these are just random numbers. And what I want to talk about is what I have learned in terms of features, designing an API for wider audience, documentation, and how to work with community, because community is the cornerstone of open source. So, features. Who of you have actually created a framework tool or something like that? Yeah, so we love to add some stuff, right? Some fancy things, some fancy functionalities that are supposed to solve all the problems, and we were like that too. Before 2.0, we were like, whoever had an idea just committed to the framework, and that led to a big ball of mud. It became it was impossible to actually maintain the whole thing. So right now, we changed a bit our approach. Since a few years ago, there weren't that many mature and ready-to-use solutions on the market. So it made sense to actually develop something on our own. Right now, there are lots of great frameworks, there are lots of great libraries, tools that are already there to be used off the shelf, and you can easily use them. So right now, we don't want to reinvent the wheel whenever we try to add something new. Before 2.0, this was the rough architecture of our framework. This was a modular framework, so we had a core module containing all the major functionalities together with some integration tests. We had a common annotation module with annotation processor over there, module for traffic, which basically handled the proxy, and module for handling emails. Two runners for Cucumber and JUnit because we thought that BDD was something cool at some point of time. Reports, we wrote our own reporting engine, and we had 3 modules dedicated to working with AEM. This is basically a bunch of page objects that allowed us to automate the authoring of the CMS. And one of the pull requests that I have made during our journey towards 2.0 contained following changes. If you're not familiar with Git, this is the amount of additions in the pull request and the amount of deletions. So adding new stuff, coding new stuff is great, but removing it, it's even better, especially if it's not your code. So what changed? A lot. We basically refactored heavily the core module together with changes to the integration tests. We have removed almost half of our code base. So annotations, reporting, JUnit, all the stuff for AEM was gone. The only left intact was traffic, email, and Cucumber. And we have replaced some stuff with new features, but they were thinner, like a lot thinner. And why was that? So in terms of reporting, a couple years ago, there weren't any great libraries that allowed you to easily add some reports. There were some options, but they weren't major like today. Today you have reports portal, you have Allure, and we decided to use Allure because it does not force you to write tests in a very specific way. You can simply add few annotations and enrich your reports with nice additional information. So it's easily applicable to your existing tests. In terms of JUnit, if you have been working with JUnit 4 and tried to extend it, it wasn't really a pleasant thing to do. We have written our own test runner, and maintaining it over time was really painful. And fortunately for us, JUnit 5 came out, and it had totally different architecture. So the Jupyter engine is basically built with extensibility in mind. The whole concept of extension points is baked into the framework, so it's easy to extend. So we decided to use it and also augment our tests with assert.j assertions. One thing to note here is that we decided to totally drop support for JUnit 4. So this forced our users to actually make some changes in their tests. Why was that? Well, because we have looked at our capabilities in terms of how many people can we actually and how many time can we spend on maintaining the framework, and it wasn't possible for us to maintain 2 different branches. So we decided to skip JUnit altogether. And in terms of Cucumber, who here loves to write Cucumber tests? Okay. So we also thought that would be great. BDD was sort of a hype a couple years ago, and a couple projects are still writing tests using Gherkin, but most of us saw that it didn't bring any value to our teams, and they were using less and less of a Cucumber-based approach. And a couple years ago, Cucumber had some problems in terms of extensibility, in terms of the Java version, the JVM1. In the past couple years, what changed is that they're refactoring heavily their internals. They added some stuff that was missing, and we had to write our own extensions. And recently, after a bumped version of the Cucumber to the latest one, we were left with a single class in that module, so I decided that it's time to give up telling our users that we have something special in terms of Cucumber, so we removed this module also. And what we have added, because you can have many great features, you can have game changers in your code, but if you do not allow your users to easily set up your tests, to use your tool, they won't care. because if the setup process is painful, they won't even reach the point where they can play with your functionalities. So what we have provided was a Gradle template. This is basically a starter kit project. You simply clone a repository, run simple shell script, and you have a framework ready to use and write tests. So post 2.0, a much clearer landscape, less stuff to maintain. We were more happier, and it allowed us to actually maintain the framework in a way that didn't cause us a lot of pain. So nowadays, the lessons that we have learned is that some features are really great, but usually in your head, because we have added a bunch of stuff that at some point we realized that we were the only ones aware that such functionality exists in the framework. So for example, what we have removed, and at some point of time we thought that it would be amazing, was our implementation of a loadable annotation that allowed you to annotate your web elements and do some explicit waits behind the scenes. It was automagical, but at some point of time, someone was raising an issue that they are not using this functionality, and it was causing some errors in their code base. So we investigated some internals of our framework and saw that, well, it's not really well covered in terms of edge cases, so we decided to simply remove it, because it was post all those fixes that we made in 2.0 made it impossible to actually save any of it. And the developer that implemented this functionality was long gone from the company, so try to understand someone's code after 3 years, it's kind of hard. We had our own annotation processor, and this was yet another piece of magic that was adding some code under the hood, but our users were not eager to actually use this functionality, and again, it was a burden to maintain. If you're familiar with Lombok project, they're also doing annotation processing, but they have an IDE extension, a plugin that tricks IDE to think that your code is compilable, even though you are using some functionalities that not explicitly defined in your code. We were not so eager to write yet another piece of code. That's why we had dropped it, because no one was actually using this functionality. And over the years, we have also changed the approach to testing altogether, because, as I mentioned, we have created 3 dedicated modules to support authoring, automating the authoring of our CMS, and people started to do funny things with that, because since we have provided the capabilities in the framework, they started to set the state of their tests through user interface, even though they had the possibility to do that via API or directly in the database. So to steer our users towards a more sensible approach to testing, we removed that functionality altogether. So nowadays, we ask a simple question when we want to add new stuff: do we really need it? And very often the answer is simply no. In terms of API, because designing some things for a wider audience is a bit different than something that you use internally. Something that I have learned that I haven't realized before is that whatever you open source, whatever you push as a public tool, becomes a contract between you and your users. Let me give an example of what that means. Let's imagine you are refactoring some stuff, and you saw that, well, this class is in a weird package, right? There is a dedicated package called wait, so let's move that class over there. Simple change. You do not touch functionality at all, but what happens after you release that change, and what happens for your users? They have a page object, right? They are looking for a very important element for them, and they are using your class that you have just refactored. Explicit waiting is an important thing in Selenium, right? So they are waiting for some visibility of that element. They bumped the version to the latest one that you have just released. Perhaps it included very important fixes that they were hoping for. And this is what happens in their IDE. Suddenly, the IDE is saying that, well, this code is not compilable. I have no idea what that particular class is. Why is that? Because they have the import pointing to the old place. And right now, you have probably broken 90% of their classes, because this is a very popular functionality that our users were using. And if you do that every week with new releases, you leave a bunch of really, really unhappy people, since this change is really easy to fix, right? It's a string you replace through your whole repository. But then again, you probably don't want to do this every single upgrade. So once again, going public means establishing a contract. And you might ask, all right, so are we not allowed to change anything? Yes, you can, but there is a way to do this. Who of you have heard about semantic versioning? And who is actually using semantic versioning in their projects? So yeah, these numbers have a meaning. This is a major, minor, and a bug fix version. So when you want to change something in a drastic way, API breaking way basically, let's imagine you have a feature, you want to remove it, right? So first, you deprecate it. In Java, there is deprecated annotation. You simply apply it to a method or a class. It will mark it in the user's IDE, telling them that, well, this class will change or get removed soon. And then, and only then, you can remove it, preferably in the major version. Because the major version allows, in terms of like what semantic versioning is, for contract breaking changes. And for example, Selenium does that with some internal APIs in the upcoming version, the number 4. And then again, there is a question how to then experiment with some stuff out there in the wild, right? How to try some experiments on your users, because we are not sure how our APIs should be structured in the longer run. So for example, what JUnit 5 does, the JUnit team, they have a bunch of experimental APIs. So you can mark some of your APIs as experimental and give your users heads up that, well, we are not sure if this is something that we will keep in future releases, but we want to give it to you so you can play with it and give some feedback to us. Perhaps we should change it. And there is a small library, API Guardian, that contains like few annotations that allows you to mark your APIs in a consistent way and inform your users about stable or unstable API. One additional story that I have, that decisions have consequences, something perhaps obvious, but not in terms of open sourcing some stuff, at least for us back then. I have written a new module, but in my project, not in the open source repository, for a new version of user interface called Touch UI. And I was experimenting then with some crazy, in that particular module, with some crazy ideas on how to perhaps change the way we approach testing. And unfortunately for us, one of the clients came and said that they will be using our toolset only if we provide some support for Touch UI automation in our framework. So what we did was assemble a tactical team, plugged that module that I have written, tried to remove some project-specific stuff from that. We failed in doing this totally, and we have open sourced that. And as already mentioned, we have, by doing so, establish a contract. But since I was hacking it all together in the project, I wasn't thinking about making it available for public to use. I wasn't thinking about if this is going to be a really sensible solution. The modular and extensible part in the case of this particular module was that our users had to copy and paste all the code and hack it inside the repositories, something that you don't want to do by providing a ready framework or a library. So for example, we had an enum describing various options on our toolbar. And one of the projects in our company actually had some additional custom options. So they couldn't use it, right? Because you cannot extend this class. And you might say that, all right, these are just strings, so what's the problem? They can provide it by simply providing the string. Unfortunately, one of the page objects consuming that had a direct reference. So you could write your own enum, but then again, you had to copy also this class and change the parameter type here. And this basically led to a chain reaction and ended up with 90% of the code base copied into their project. So there was actually no point of using our module. So in terms of 2.0, we have used the dedicated tools for that. So interfaces and the dependency injection framework that we are using Juice. And right now, we do something else. So before, when you encountered something like that, you were injecting a concrete class. Now, when you encounter something like this, that's probably an interface. And in our modules in Bobcat, we are binding the interface to some default implementations that we provide. And if our users for some reason decide that, well, we need to do something different because we aren't happy with how you implemented some stuff, they can write their own implementation, provide a binding in their project module, and that's all that they have to do. Everything else works perfectly fine. And we applied the same mindset to the whole module structure. We have a dedicated module containing only interfaces and APIs. And then for all the other versions, we have concrete default implementations contained over there. The next element is something that probably all of you love, right? Writing documentation. And actually, in response to that internal email that I was talking about that we have sent in the company, one of our developers, Maciej Laskowski, he was here on Testwarez previous year talking about performance tests, said that we have great docs on Wiki. And it was actually true, because we have spent weeks documenting stuff and describing some features that we have provided. But what I have noticed over the years was something like this, that everyone was so eager to write some new functionality, but when it came to documenting it, not really. And we have ended up in a situation where at some point, after a couple of changes, you had documentation saying one thing and the implementation saying something else. It confused our users. It really did not help in communicating with them. And also GitHub, in terms of wiki, is kind of painful to handle because it's a separate repository under the hood. It does not allow you to actually connect easily the changes that you are doing in the code base with the documentation. And the wiki format is somewhat limiting, and people basically expect more. So what we have done was created a dedicated site that basically contains the whole documentation. It's kept together with the code base, so there is no excuse to not actually provide docs for the changes that you are doing. We are using Jekyll. That's just a Ruby-based static site generator, popular among bloggers, and you basically provide a new page by specifying a single markdown file, so nothing complicated. And you are writing documentation not for your own pleasure, right? Because no one is actually doing that. You are writing it for your community. And as I already mentioned, community is basically what defines open source, right? Because you are writing some stuff and putting it in the public for some other people to use. You expect to contribute with others, and basically that's it when it comes to open source. What I have learned about community aspect is that it's very, very important to establish clear communication channels. And since open source work is by nature more asynchronous, emails are actually working really great. Everyone has an email, right? So it's really a great tool. Actually, today I've received an email that someone had encountered an issue, something is not working again. And but sometimes there is a need of a heated discussion, and you can do that on instant messaging for like Slack, or for example Gitter, that allow you to log in with your GitHub credentials that you already have because you are hosting the project on GitHub. Other useful elements are templates. So you can specify an issue and pull request template, forcing your users to use a specific format, applying some reproduction steps, describing what versions are they using. And in terms of pull request templates, you can provide a checklist for your contributors where they have to mark that they have written tests, documentation, and they are agreeing to the contributing rules that you can also define, and GitHub will push it to the contributors. And one funny thing is that we are writing test automation framework, right? Dedicated for testing community. And guess what? This is a quote that I have encountered on the Selenium Slack, and this is also true in our case. Testers are making the worst possible bug reports. We have received number of issues saying that, well, something is not working on my end. Great, but what version are you using? What actually modules are you using? What are you testing? What is your use case? We didn't receive any information. And when you ask for them, everyone is silent, and then a couple months later they come back and tell, where is my bug fix, right? So not everyone also reads the documentation that you are providing. This also adds to the motivation to actually write that, right? But it's not always the user's fault. We have discovered that in a couple of instances, we have buried the necessary documentation under some weird navigation or written a lot of text that wasn't actually bringing any value. So writing readable documentation is actually something hard. And funny thing is that people have expectations, and very often unreasonable, because they expect that everything away and run to solving their problems. And funny thing is that most of the open source projects are someone's work exposed for free and is maintained by a bunch of volunteers that do that in their own free time. So please give a bit back. There is a high chance that all of you are using at least one open source library in your projects, even though you might not be aware of that. So write the documentation, right? Maybe write the tests. We are a testing community. People often ask how they can start working with testing. So starting testing. So they can write a test for one of the libraries. There is not always not enough testing, so you can do that. You can submit an issue. Either a bug fix, a bug description, or perhaps an improvement. And you can give some feedback about potential features that you want to be included in your framework that you are using. And help someone. Go through the issues. Maybe someone encountered a problem that you have solved in the past. And ideally, submit the bug fix yourself. And there is actually an open initiative right now, still till the very end of October, called Hacktoberfest. It's hosted by DigitalOcean together with Dev Community. You can receive a free t-shirt if you submit 4 pull requests to any GitHub repository. So why not? And ending with a question, would we do it again? In terms of open sourcing new projects, yes, and we are still doing that, and it's fun. You can learn a lot, especially about designing software for a wider audience. But would we write yet another Selenium framework nowadays? Not really, because there are a lot of great solutions out there for any language that you want to write in. So there's really no point in writing yet another framework. And if you want to check this framework out, you can visit our GitHub. There is a bunch of other stuff over there also related with testing and QA. So ideally, if you want to submit something, I would be very happy. Go check out Fluent Lenium. Radek will also probably be very, very, very thankful for that. There are also other projects, like you can grab Marcus over here at the conference and talk about how to contribute to Selenium and be famous. So that's it from me. Thank you so much, and I'm open to questions.
Please raise your hands. You can ask questions anonymously through the app.
You mentioned about documentation, and maybe can you say a few words about testing your software, how you deploy and test it on the open source?
Yeah, so we have a continuous integration set up on Travis. That is actually building everything that we do. We are writing unit tests for our framework, so actually we are testing the testing tool that we are building, and it's kind of important, and not always people are doing that because they think that unit testing is crazy hard, but it's not. It forces you to write testable code, which in the end makes it more maintainable. And we are also testing different browsers and mobile devices. We have Appium actually used under the hood for our mobile devices, and we are using BrowserStack for the cloud as a cloud provider. All different cloud providers, like for example BrowserStack, Source Labs, cross-browser testing, Applitools, provide free accounts to open source projects. So the whole process took me like 15 minutes, and I got an account for browser stack. So we are testing various browsers also there. And the Travis actually setup is somewhat complicated because there is a matrix of different jobs, and Travis is also limited. So we are probably going to switch to something more modern. But one of our projects is using, for example, Azure DevOps as the CI solution. So we're probably gonna take a look at that.
Any follow-up questions?
Yeah, I'm just curious. How did you find
Can't
out?
hear you.
What about now?
Yep.
Is it better? Okay, so I'm just curious. How did you find out which areas are not required anymore for the community?
Yeah, so actually funny thing is that, for example, I mentioned the loadable, right? Annotation that we have removed. Last week or 2 weeks ago, one of our external users raised an issue that they're actually using it heavily, and how are we supposed to work nowadays without that functionality? So we have a workaround for that. It's actually quite easy. But yeah, it's kind of hard because we have a bunch of projects in our company, so we saw what people are using. We were also using this tool ourselves, so we saw that, well, we even as a creators of particular functionalities are not using it, so there is high chance that others are also doing the same. But what I am thinking about adding, but this is kind of a tricky thing to do, is actually including analytics in the code base. This is something that Zalando is doing, for example, with Selenium. They are actually gathering statistics and having analytics from different parts of the functionalities, what is actually happening with their software. And this is something that we'll probably be adding to the code base.
Thank you. Any other questions? I'd like to jump in, if I may. Have you faced any legal challenges or issues while going open source?
Quite opposite, because we started to open source our projects, our internal ones, because our clients were not so eager to use our proprietary software. Because enterprise companies have funny processes, right, and procurement that needs to actually go through a whole journey to accept some tools. And when going open source, we basically show them that this is publicly available. You are not buying in on some particular solution. If you really want to change it drastically, just fork it and make your own implementation and be happy. So it even allowed us to implement this particular tool or others open source in some projects where before clients said, no, we want to use something that is not done by you as a company, but something publicly available and free that we won't have to pay for. So yeah, but licensing is tricky, so we had some help with the legal department.
Thank you, Michał. Any other questions? There's one more.
Okay, so you have mentioned that there is a lot of other software now on the market, and probably in your company you are not using only this.
Yes.
Yeah. So in this case, what is more important for you and for your team? Are you like developing this framework and maintain, because it's a great experience of open source application framework, or because this is used in your company and it's like more important? What more important?
Yeah, so before we were actually having like a blessed or recommended tools by the QA department, but it was actually forcing all the projects to use particular tool set, not asking them what are their actual needs, and people were not happy. We actually had somewhat of a PR problem internally in terms of the company, because a couple of projects were not happy with Bobcat because it was too complicated for them. They wanted something simpler, easier to set up, and it was fine. So it's kind of hard to actually discuss with other teams, and they're asking what kind of tools are you supposed to use when you are creating one, and not force them to use this one, because that's a great experience that people are using something that you have created, and tell them that nah, this sucks, right, and use something else. And but this is also a bit of a journey that you need to reach a point that you have to admit that, all right, your tool is great for this particular stuff, because, for example, you have developers that want to write in Java, and on the other hand, where there are more front-end focused projects, maybe they want to write in something based on JavaScript, right? And right now we have like people, teams writing in Bobcat, Protractor, Robot Framework. Cypress is also one of the tools that we are experimenting now with. So it's now open market for anything, and it's my job to promote this tool as a creator, but I'm not forcing it on all their teams. So
Thank you. We have time for one more question. If not, then let's give a big hand to Michał.